We have a great conversation on deck with some great design leaders here at Atlassian. And while we are waiting for everyone to check in, let's just kind of go around and do some introductions. Let's start with you, Zack.
Hi, I'm Zack Gottlieb. I'm the head of platform design. Sorry, getting started. I've been at Atlassian for almost 9 months, and before that, I led user driver experience at Uber for about 5 years.
Great. Marin?
Hi, I'm Marin Hotvedt, and I am a senior designer at Atlassian looking after our customers' server to cloud migration experience. I've been at Atlassian in that role for about 1.5 years now, and prior to that worked at a startup in Sydney.
Courtney?
Hey there, I'm Courtney Drake, and I am a design manager for Trello at Atlassian, and I've been here for 3.5, almost 4 years. And I work remotely from Denver. Prior to COVID to Trello's we're pretty much 100% now remote, but before that we were about like 65% remote. So doing the same old thing these days.
And Leisa?
Hello, I'm Leisa Reichel. I lead the research and insights team here at Atlassian. I'm based in Sydney. I have my dog on my lap at the moment, so hopefully it's keeping me very warm, but hopefully she stays quiet. I've been at Atlassian for almost 3 years. So I'm glad you're here, Courtney. Otherwise, I thought I would be like the old timer.
Great, thank you. And I'm Dominique Ward. I lead design operations here at Atlassian. I've been here for about 1.5 years. And I have the pleasure of working with all of these great design leaders. So looking forward to sharing some of the wisdom that I get to work with every day. So just to kick off, how should designers go about putting together a portfolio? I mean, that's how we're here. That's why we're here. When they're kind of seeking their first or second role and have limited experience, what's the best way for them to jump in? Courtney?
Yeah, so my background getting into design was a little bit untraditional. I got an MBA and then became a product manager and then transitioned into design at the same company while I was in product and then became a design manager. And so when I was looking for my second job as a designer, I'd done the job for like 1 year at a company. And so I feel that I definitely felt that feeling where you're like, how am I going to get this job? I only have so many examples of work in my background. So I do think you definitely can still have a robust portfolio, even if you're looking at your first or second role, especially if we're looking at an entry-level role. Other designers who are going to be applying for that job are likely going to be in a similar position as you are. So you're not expected to have a portfolio that looks like a senior designer. You're going to kind of have the same level of depth as a lot of other folks. And when you're thinking about what goes into it, when I'm looking at portfolios as a manager, I'm not looking for sheer quantity of work. What I'm looking for more is a range of quality work that has real impact. So I've seen super strong portfolios that have 3 to 5 projects in them. But what I'm really looking for is showing range. So show you've handled various examples of, or various kind of levels of complexity of problem solving, show that you can design on web and mobile, show that you have strong interaction chops and visual design chops, show that you can do research, so that you can execute and ship design. And if you feel like you're lacking in projects, really just think strategically about what are the skills that you're not demonstrating yet in your portfolio, and then how can you pick up like a freelance project or a volunteer project or a side gig with a friend to really exercise those muscles and be able to have a project in your portfolio that shows the range you're trying to show.
Great, thanks. That's really interesting. You mentioned a bunch of different kind of specialties or lenses that you could take and what you want to bring to it. So kind of continuing on that bent from a structural perspective, what are some key elements that designers should really include in their portfolio presentation to make sure that it's both compelling and kind of to avoid being too cookie cutter? I'm actually also interested in hearing what Leisa has to say on this as well.
I can start and then Leisa add on from a research perspective. So when I think about structure for a portfolio, I like the structure of situation, behavior, impact, but a little bit tweaked for design. So first of all, kind of set the problem space. What is the situation you're in? What's the problem you're trying to solve? This should be concise, but it should also explain enough depth that you kind of set up the rest of the example that you're looking at. But also you need to explain it in a way that someone who doesn't have context either in the industry or like deep in that problem space can understand it. So start with problem and then talk about what your role is and who you partnered with. I think it's actually super important to be upfront about how you contributed. I think it can be tempting to overstate your role, but getting to the interview stage and actually explaining your portfolio, a manager will see right through that if you've overstated it. So super important, I think, to be honest about what your role was in the project. And then go into the behavior part, which is really in the design context is your design process. So I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel here. There's a pretty kind of standard design process a lot of folks follow. And so you want to show that you have a process behind your design. So how you navigate a problem, how you explore solutions, how you validate assumptions, how you get into design or into the actual design work, and how you actually get design into code. So super important to show visuals here. That can include sketches, it can be user flows, can be research insights, can be UI and prototypes, that kind of thing. And then the last one is impact, and I see a lot of portfolios that don't have this piece. But I actually think it's one of the most important parts, partially because I come from a product background. So I'm always asking like, so what changed? Did you change user behavior? Did you change a metric? Did you have impact on a business? So yeah, that's kind of the structure that I like. I think if you follow that structure, it makes it really scannable for recruiters and for managers. It communicates you're a structured thinker. So I wouldn't worry too much about it being cookie cutter in that kind of that structure. But you can definitely express your individuality through your visual design, through your writing, through your actual work. That's where you'll kind of shine as an individual.
Leisa?
All right. I think so. Portfolios are kind of interesting from a research point of view, really, because they are, I think, very much about the talking and not so much about the looking or the writing as such. So when, in terms of like what you're presenting for your portfolio, what you're really looking for is like diversity, I think. To Courtney's point, like we really want to see the variety of the things that you've done and the breadth of the experience that you've had. And so choosing what you're going to put into your portfolio, I think is super important. And thinking about it like in that way, like how can I really show the breadth of what I've done? That's not necessarily going to be a checkbox of methodologies. It's really easy for people to go, oh, look, here's my survey example, here's my diary study example. It could be, they could be diverse in terms of the domains that you're looking at, or the different kinds of business problems that you're trying to solve as well. So be really, think editorially about what you're going to put into your portfolio. Then I think one of the big problems that we see people running up against when they're doing portfolio reviews for research is not talking enough about what they did and why they did it, and talking too much about what they learned. It can be really so what I don't want to see is your research report. I don't want to see the outcomes of what you learned at the end. And we do see that fairly often. Super interesting. Like I do love to know what you learned, but what I really need to understand is like, what did you do and why did you do it and how did you do it? Really get into the nitty gritty of that. And the thing that I'm always really looking for beyond everything else is the why. Why did you do that? What was your thinking behind that? Because what we're really looking for in these portfolios is a sense of like, how are you going to approach problems in the future? How are you going to think about how to break things down and make decisions? And that making sure that you can really demonstrate that foundational understanding is really important. But it can be super tempting to skim over that. So I think it's about trying to think about how you tell that story that makes it really clear that you do understand, the rationale as to the approach that you've taken. If there are opportunities to talk about how you shaped that project as well, I think that's a very important thing to do. That you're not just, you're not a short order cook for research that's been told go and do personas, and so then you've gone and done personas. So there's all different things, all different kinds of opportunities that there are for you to use your portfolio to help show both your kind of technical capability, but also some of the really important soft skills as well. I think there are lots of different ways that you can structure that. I think Courtney's SBI approach is a really good one to take if you need a particular structure.
Yeah, that's great. And thinking of, I had an actually interesting conversation with the design manager earlier today, and she said, your process is your story. And so thinking about on that kind of lens of things, how do you weigh the importance of demonstrating your process versus the final work in your design portfolio? Zach?
Great question. Well, I think when I look at portfolios, the final work may be what gets you the interview, right? We look at, it looks like it's been well thought out. It's the details are there, but it's ultimately the process that's going to tell the whole story of like, actually, why is that good design and how did you get there? I put a lot more on that, emphasis on that. If you're going into a portfolio review, that's what I want to see. The end result is good, but the process to me is the thing that's going to be, how are you going to be able to adapt? How are you going to be able to have impact on your teams over the long run, right? It's not about making things slick. It's about having the impact. And so I really heavily weigh on process more than what they, how something finally looks. Yeah.
And designers, as they're kind of thinking about how they share their case studies, storytelling is a big component of that. How do you suggest that designers build or improve their storytelling skills, Maren?
That's a good question. And I think it helps to think about kind of the structure of what you're going to be asked to do. So generally speaking, you're going to get on a call with somebody and they're going to say, hello, why don't we introduce ourselves? And you're both going to introduce yourselves. And that's kind of your first moment to start telling your story, right? So even just thinking through and having a plan for what exactly is the structure of this conversation going to be like, I think is really helpful. So again, it's going to be some form of introductions. You're probably going to walk through 2 to 3 different case studies, and there's probably going to be 15 minutes at the end. So start just by understanding like what is the structure generally of a portfolio review to begin with. And then when it gets into really the storytelling pieces, the Q&A, you can kind of leave that behind. It's really your introduction to yourself and the work that you've done and, why you're interested in this particular company or this particular role. Think about what is that you want to tell and actually practice that. And that's kind of the second thing I would say is, following on Leisa and Courtney's advice to kind of follow a structured framework where you're talking about what was the situation, what was the behavior. So situation is basically, I like to think of it as more problem, like what was the problem we were trying to solve? What did we do about it? What was the approach? That's the behavior. What was my role in that? And how did I work with the others around me? How did we overcome challenges like COVID-19 coming up in the middle of a project that we were working on with a really tight timeline? How can you take that and just explain succinctly for the person what's happening? And then don't forget the impact. So again, just know the structure that you're going into. And then I would say practice. So one thing I think people forget to do, and myself included, is just talk through it with somebody else. It doesn't even have to be a subject matter expert. It could be your partner, it could be your dog, if that's all you have. But it really does help to talk through it and get somebody's feedback so that you can improve and take that on.
Zack, given that you came from Uber, you've kind of worked in the product design space, but for designers who need to frame their portfolio and when they're interviewing for a role that's in a new problem space or a new industry, how do you suggest they go about that framing, especially when it can be hard from switching, for example, from consulting to product or from enterprise to consumer?
Well, I think that the first thing that I look for is potential, right? You want to see how do people solve problems, right? It doesn't matter what area they're solving the problems in. Do they have a good structure and a framework to work through? Because if you can solve problems, you can solve problems anywhere. And, you know, ultimately, even if you're in a consumer space and you change to another consumer space, it may be different, but you're still going to have to get up to speed. So I think being able to tell the story of how you have the potential to change really easily, to move and understand problem spaces, you can apply that to any industry. And so I think, you know, ultimately just being able to show the flexibility, the process you would apply to it, because I don't think it's going to change that much. You know, empathy for your users. How do you think about them, and how did you really quickly get up to speed? That's the things I'm going to want to know is, if I put this person in this particular spot, how are they going to perform? Are they going to be able to pick things up pretty easily? Are they going to apply what they've already learned, or are they going to feel, you know, out of sorts? So again, it goes back to what potential do I think this person has, and how do they solve their problems with what they've already done? And I think that especially for new job seekers or designers that are just, you know, new and in beginning of their career, you're going to be thrown at all kinds of problems. This is not just even coming out of school. You're going to have the problem of how do I get up to speed on some of these things, because the problems that are going to be thrown at you are going to be very different and complex compared to some of the things you may have solved in the future, especially or in the past when you're at school. So just have a really solid understanding of how you want to go about solving problems, and I think you'll be okay.
Great. Maren and Courtney, I'm interested in getting your perspectives on this. What are some common questions or themes that designers should anticipate when they're going through a portfolio review?
I can start. So I think it all, again, just maps back to, you know, they're going to be questions that follow that general structure of situation, behavior, impact. So digging in on things like, you know, okay, we understand the problem, you know, who are the users that you were designing for, and how did you define that, or how did you understand that? Thinking about questions related to the behavior, you know, why did you take this approach? What other approaches did you consider? And then thinking about impact, which is, you know, what are your kind of metrics for success? Again, like, why did you choose those metrics for success? How did you help define those? Was it part of a team? Was that your role? So I think really just thinking through the general structure of the portfolio, and then just anticipating kind of, you know, what are the things that I think somebody might want to know that is evaluating me for this role is a really good starting point. They may throw you curveballs, obviously, but that's a really good start to at least prepare yourself.
Yeah, those are all great ones. I'll layer on a few, and I'm going to kind of echo a bit of what Leisa said about what she's looking for in a portfolio. Is that a lot of the questions I'll ask during a portfolio review, trying to understand how a person thinks and how they have responded to the hard situations in a project. So it might be kind of like, how did you decide to do this, or why didn't you take this other approach? If you were working with other people in a project, which probably inevitably you were, how did you handle conflict, or how did you handle hard decisions together and navigate those? So yeah, just really kind of, I'll probe throughout the discussion to just try to understand how they think, how they make decisions. And it's just going a layer deeper on their process. I always like to ask what you would have done differently if you could have done the project over again, because I like to see if you are self-aware and reflective. And then definitely at the end of a portfolio review, I always ask what questions interviewees have. So think about that before you go into an interview, because if you're caught flat-footed on that doesn't come off great.
Oh, plus one to what would you have done differently? I think that's a common one that people really like to ask. And it's honestly a little bit concerning when people are like, I would do nothing differently, which, you know, something to think about. That shows that you maybe haven't reflected quite enough on the project.
Right. Things can always be improved. So Maren, I'd like to hear from Leisa on this. There are so many people who are interested in a career in design or in a career in research that don't necessarily have a design degree or come from a traditional design background. how might they best show their skills and knowledge, even if they don't fit the criteria that's on paper?
Yeah, so this is a very common challenge, I will say, that I think a lot of people face. You know, Courtney mentioned that she doesn't come from a design background. I personally don't come from a design background. So I think it's, I don't know who else on the call, but I'm sure other people, you know, face this situation. And I think part of it is just understanding that the design process that Zack was talking about earlier doesn't necessarily have to apply to a traditional design challenge. So you can think about how you've approached other aspects of your work using kind of the design thinking process and showcase something about that. Because, you know, that still demonstrates how you think like a designer, even if you weren't in a design role per se. And then there's always other opportunities to learn and practice and get skill and knowledge that you can show that relates. So for example, for myself, like I went through General Assembly and did a bunch of example projects through that. And that's actually how I transitioned into design originally. And that's obviously not a path that everybody can take, but just thinking outside the box and not letting that lack of quote unquote the title constrain you, but thinking, okay, how can I actually show that I'm a design thinker, even if my title is not designer?
Leisa?
I think from a research point of view, there are many more non-traditional pathways in maybe even than there are for design. So I don't even know what a design background is in a sort of traditional sense. We have people in our team who come from anthropology, from psychology, from architecture, all kinds of different places. So and that diversity, having that diversity of backgrounds in the team is something that we really value and that we look to try to grow and enhance, because it really brings something to the team, having people from all these different backgrounds. So having a different background can be a really valuable thing and something that you shouldn't necessarily try to underplay. I think to Marin's point, like, and maybe research even more than just, maybe not, but there are so many opportunities out there right now for you to go and demonstrate what you know how to do and how you think about things, how you approach things, without necessarily having that as part of your job right now. So, you know, it's not a huge amount of effort necessarily to do a usability test on your least favorite product, for example, or your most favorite product, and talk about like how you did it, why you did it, what you learned, all of those kinds of things. Or, you know, any kind of little small research project. I think you do need to demonstrate that you care about doing this work enough that you actually do it, and you do need to have taken the time to have pieces of work that you can show. But it, you know, I think especially for those kind of entry-level roles, we're looking for potential. We're looking for energy and enthusiasm and aptitude, and it doesn't need to be in a formal commercial setting or a formal academic setting or anything like that really at all. Whatever you can do to help show how you think and why you care about things can be sort of a vehicle to an opportunity, I think. And that's yeah, I don't think we're super fussy about what you show us. What we're looking for is like, how have you been creative and passionate about being able to share your knowledge in a way that helps us understand it better.
Continuing on around like, one, you may not have the right background, or maybe you do and you're just starting out. How do you actually evaluate from a leveling perspective in the interview process? So what makes a junior designer versus a lead designer, besides kind of years of experience? Zack?
So, I mean, the first thing you're going to look at, especially from a portfolio standpoint, is just the complexity of the problem, right? How big of a challenge are they facing? How do they navigate it? That's where the storytelling comes in. What level of exploration did they apply here? What questions did they ask? What was the team like? Was it were they the single person on the team doing all this work, or were they part of a team driving, alongside other designers? That gives you a better sense of the type of work that they can do, the type of work or the types of challenges they're willing to take on. their drive, and ultimately you're going to look at how they solved the problem, what the output was, what the impact was, and you evaluate from there. Sure, years of experience is kind of a base leveling. It kind of gives you a general sense of where people might be, but look, there's all kinds of outliers. I've seen people that have, they've only been official designers for a few years and they're operating at a crazy high level. And a lot of times, by the way, going back to that first question around not having a traditional design background, a lot of those people are the self-taught ones, right? They just have this crazy drive and they're already operating at a super high level, right? So looking at years of experience just isn't a great gauge. So yeah, complexity, how you think about your work, what the level of detail, the care, right? Even going back to how you present your portfolio, don't use cookie cutter stuff, right? That's another place where you can really differentiate yourself and show that you've thought about this from an experiential standpoint of how you're presenting this portfolio rather than just like, here's my work. So those are all the things that I'm looking at when I start to say, okay, where does this person actually fall on the spectrum of seniority?
Courtney?
Yeah, I think just a few other things I'm looking at too is like one is a history of getting things done in collaboration with other people. So like trying to understand, did you facilitate to like a group of people that might have been difficult to align to a decision? How do you build consensus? How do you collaborate with other people? So like a more senior designer is going to be able to drive change through other people than kind of like riding the coattails of a PM or engineering lead, or just like being in that learning stance earlier in their career. I also am looking at communication skills in an interview. So I want to see you can communicate clearly, you're concise, you can tell me a story and bring me along with you. You can bring me into the conversation as a collaborator in your conversation. That's kind of like very high level skill, I think, in an interview, is that you really engage your interviewer and you have that kind of confidence. And I will say, especially if you're looking at remote roles, that is one of the most important things we look at Trello, is that people kind of have a really high emotional quotient or EQ, because when you're remote, you have fewer physical cues in your communication to draw on. And so we're looking for really, really strong communicators when we're looking at more senior designers.
Actually, Leisa, if you have any additional things to add from a research perspective as you think about leveling your researchers.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, it's about the first part of your career is very much about craft capability. And so the first couple of roles that you have, what we're really looking at is making sure that you're completely solid on the craft. And that's your main focus. And then as you get up into the more senior roles, then it's all about influence and impact, and a lot of the things that Courtney's just talked about. So as you move into sort of senior and lead roles, but we assume that your craft is solid and we don't really have to think about that anymore. But we're looking at what's the influence and impact that you're having both in our research discipline at Atlassian. So how are you helping to bring up the juniors, and how are you bringing your particular expertise and your particular background and adding that into, the breadth of capability that the team and our discipline here at Atlassian has. And then probably more importantly than that, how can we see the way that you are interacting with other people in the organization is changing what's happening and how it's happening, and that you being there and having done the work that you've done is changing kind of the direction that things are traveling in. And I think that just goes on, further and further up the chain, you get bigger and more complicated problems to influence and more challenging people to be influencing with. And that's very much how I describe it to people in my team when we're thinking about career progression. And so when you're thinking about applying for a role, then I think you want to look at the level that you're applying for and kind of calibrate what you're focusing on based on that. So if it is those more entry-level roles, then it's very much kind of craft focused. And if it is much more senior roles, then I think it's much more about influencing and impacting.
Great, thank you. A lot of designers come upon this as they start to work throughout their careers, where some of their work is covered under NDA. So when thinking about your portfolio, how can you best build a compelling presentation when you can't really talk about all of those things? Zack?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a perfect answer to this. I guess it kind of depends. Look, the first advice I'll give you is if you're going to show anything, don't do it. You know, people have shown me stuff in person. That's still on shaky ground because I wouldn't want people from my team doing that. So I wouldn't want to see that, and made me kind of question how their judgment. Look, I think if you don't have any work, first thing, you can remove a bunch of, try and take the logos off. You can certainly show the work and talk about the problem in general, about how you're driving towards a solution. That's probably the best way to do it. Again, this is kind of a shaky ground question, so I think you have to use your best judgment, but I would err on the side of caution. I don't think it's not black and white, unfortunately. But yeah, use your best judgment.
Leisa, I'm also interested in your perspective, given that a lot of what researchers would be presenting is customer information. How would you suggest that they go about that?
I think anonymization is the key. Sometimes it's a little bit kind of hackneyed, like as you know what company somebody's coming from, and they go, I worked for a financial services company, and this is the project that I did. It's kind of, it is obvious to an extent, but I think you really need to look at, again, how can you focus on the work that you did, on the situation, the behavior, the impact. You can still tell those stories without having to add a whole lot of detail around who it was for, who you talked to, exactly what you learned, and be really respectful of the information that you've agreed not to share. So I think it's entirely possible. It takes more work. And what you really need to be kind of focusing on is, how can I tell this story in a way that's still specifically concrete? So it's got enough detail in it, but it doesn't have the detail in it that's not particularly shareable. But I've seen a lot of people do it over the years, and it's entirely possible to do it. You just have to be really careful about what aspects of the story you focus on telling. From a research point of view, it's a really great time not to tell me what you learned. Just to tell me about the process that you went through and the impact that you were able to have in the organization, or more about like what the problem was and why you chose this particular way to approach it. There's lots and lots of stuff that you can share that helps give us a window into, the experiences that you've had and the ways that you're thinking about. And I think that really is like the main thing. If you think about, from our point of view, what are we looking for? We're looking to have conversations with you that are grounded in particular projects that you've done that help us understand, your experience and your way of thinking, and to start to sort of get an understanding of how you might approach things in the future if we were to work together. And so really think about, like, how can you tell that story to help make it easier for people in our situation to have the kinds of conversations with you that are going to unlock that. And that, for me, in a lot of respects, is what the portfolio review is all about. It's about that opportunity to sort of stimulate the conversations that we can have in a kind of concrete way that help us understand, like, how you think of work.
Great, thank you so much. Kind of on a similar trend, like thinking about showing versus tell, and how that should kind of come into a portfolio. Really, and kind of the underlying question is a recruiter and are the hiring managers really looking at my portfolio, or should you limit the words, or are they just kind of scanning it? What do you think, Courtney? How should designers approach show versus tell?
Yeah, so I can't speak for recruiters, but as a hiring manager, I definitely do read the writing. So partially, I want to see how effectively you communicate in written form. That's something designers do on the job all the time. You're gonna do some UX writing on the job, but also written communication is part of just being a designer. I'm also looking to see if there are spelling or grammatical errors, because that's telling me how much attention to detail you have. So that's super important to make sure it's tight on that front. And yeah, I mean, you really want to have just enough explanation that a hiring manager can understand what the problem was, how you responded, what you produced, what the impact was. So you really want to tell that story. And if it's super long, that's telling me that a designer can't communicate concisely. So I wouldn't actually focus so much on how many words you're using as much as how well are you communicating your message? Is it coming through? And I think if you're achieving that, it won't be too wordy or long. So I don't think anyone can give like a word count for how long a case study should be. It's more just about how effectively are you communicating that your process and your thinking and the outcomes.
Right. So we talk a lot about imposter syndrome at Atlassian, and it's one of those things that can affect you at any level of your career. But obviously, as a junior designer, if you're really early in your career, it's kind of it's tricky to navigate, especially if you haven't really had mentorship or support in the industry. Courtney, how do you think designers can work to overcome that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've dealt with my fair share of imposter syndrome pretty much at every juncture in my career where I was transitioning to something different. But certainly when I was transitioning from product to design, at the time I was asking myself daily if I'd made a horrible mistake, if I had completely ruined my career, whether I could be successful in the role. So it's really tough. I think the things that really helped me, I talked about what was going on in my head with my husband. If there are people around you who can just kind of instill more confidence in you, prop you up, keep telling you you're capable of accomplishing what you want, that can be super powerful. I think the other big thing is project more confidence than you actually feel in any given moment. I think it's kind of hard to do, but if you can fake it, the actual confidence will come. So just like keep projecting, like keep kind of amplifying more confidence than you're feeling in any given situation. And I just think just keep moving forward. So like for me, what that looked like was just buckling down, doing as much as I could to learn and improve on the job. If you're in a position where you're job searching and feeling imposter syndrome because of that, that may mean just keep on applying for roles, keep talking to people, keep making connections, keep working on projects to build out your portfolio. So just that forward movement, I think, is really helpful for pushing through imposter syndrome. And then, yeah, if you don't already have a mentor, that can be really helpful too. So I think it might be a little bit harder right now because we're all remote right now in various levels, and meetups aren't really happening the way that they were before. But I know there are sites like, I think it's recreate.com, where you can find mentors. You can also start following designers and engage on social media, and that can be a good avenue to make a connection. But you really just want to find someone who you genuinely connect with and be honest. Like it's someone you can talk to about where you're at, what's going on with you, what you want, and have just a genuine relationship with. I don't know if other folks have good mentorship resources, but that's my 2 cents.
Can I just say something on the imposter syndrome?
Absolutely.
Because I think this is such a super common thing. I think that the 2 things, first of all, Courtney touched on it, like projecting confidence. Don't apologize. Don't explain all of the reasons why your work isn't as good as you'd like it to be when you're about to present it. Just present it. And I see so many people do this, and particularly women, but I'm not confined to women, where they, before they start sharing anything, there's like 10 minutes of apologies for why it is the way that it is, and it just undermines everything. So that's one thing. I think the other thing too, this is very kind of relevant to sort of how we work at Atlassian as well, is really lean into openness, even though it is the exact opposite of what you feel like you want to do, because you feel so insecure a lot of the times about the work that you're doing. The best thing you can do is open it up early and get feedback from other colleagues really early on, because the longer that you keep it to yourself and the more precious you get about it, the worse this is going to be and the harder it's going to be to overcome. So the best thing, I think, is that you can possibly do is to work as openly as you possibly can and get that feedback all the way through, get that guidance all the way through, and that way you know that other people have had eyes on this, and that you've been available to that feedback all the way through, and it makes it it sounds more terrifying, but it actually makes it a lot less terrifying.
Yeah, just one other thing about feedback, excuse me, especially when you're just starting out. Don't be afraid to ask feedback, even if you don't get the role. I did this really early on. I asked everybody, and I got turned down for lots of roles. I asked everybody for feedback. Well, what was it? and you start to get, what you're going to find is you get a lot better really fast, and you start to figure things out. And that's what builds the confidence too, right? Once you go into a situation, you're like, okay, I've checked off these boxes. I kind of know exactly where my story was falling down or what I want to tell now. That will make you better. Just having that feedback, it's a gift. So ask for it. Don't be embarrassed to ask for it. It's totally fine. And most people will give it to you without, it's generosity, right? That's the key thing.
And Leisa, this is for you and Zack, and I'd love for you to go first, Leisa. What is the difference in the work that is being presented to you from a portfolio perspective between a leadership candidate and a more junior IC?
I think it is, so again, in a leadership role, it could be either an individual contributor leader or a manager leader. So I think you're looking for two different things there. But in a lot of cases, it's about complexity. Like what is like the more leading roles, I would expect to be able to have much more complicated and difficult projects to talk about. So there's a level of complexity that you're looking for there. The other thing that you're looking for, I think, is what work have you done to help coordinate the work that's actually happened? What's the role that you've played in helping other people contribute to the project and be successful? How have you thought about who else is involved and how they're being involved as well? Those are probably the two main things that come out. And maybe the third thing there as well, and I touched on this earlier, is just that real sense of having agency in how that work has happened. So it's not something that's happened to you and you've just executed it. You're playing a role in really shaping and are responsible for how that project has played out. You're taking responsibility for it. So a lot of the time, it's not uncommon in a research project that somebody will talk about, oh, here's this great process, I went through all of it, and then at the end it always ends up with, well, unfortunately, the organization just wasn't ready for it. Well, unfortunately, leadership just, at a leadership level portfolio presentation, you cannot do that. You cannot do that because your ability to bring people along and to make an influence is part of what's being evaluated.
Plus one to pretty much everything Leisa just said. I'll add only a few things. Certainly from leadership standpoint, I'm really looking to see, is this person a multiplier? Do they make everybody else around them better, right? And that's the storytelling of like, hey, I had to lead with a number of designers. Here's what the challenge was. Here's how I organized it. Here's how I was able to give feedback and provide the support that the teams need. Here's how I was able to work with my counterparts in engineering, in design, engineering, product, research, data science, how I made everybody else around me better. That's the first thing I really want to see from a leadership standpoint. I think the other is just diversity. And I think this goes back to what Leisa was saying, is it's not great if you say, well, I did all these things, and then at the end of the day, the company decided they didn't want to do it. I want to hear the story of how you fought for something and you made it happen, right? That's going to show just your level of commitment and engagement to make things happen. Like a lot of the times we have to create things out of nothing, and it just takes enormous amounts of energy and strength to make that. I want to see, does this person have the level of to push on the adversity when it occurs and push through it and make things happen.
And before we go into Q&A from the audience, I have one final question for you. And this is for everyone, so jump in. What's one mistake you see in portfolio reviews, and how would you recommend avoiding it? Start with you, Zack.
Not giving credit where credit is due, right? It goes back to, I think Courtney is the one who said it right off the bat. People kind of taking credit for everything in there and not telling what the team did. I've even had people show up with two different people interview, and they both had the same project in their portfolio, and they both told the same story of how they kind of were the lead and they did all this work. Look, it's a team sport. At the end of the day, just give credit to your partners in it, right? That's what we want to see, is just understanding what you did. So just give credit.
I get a really simple one, and it's timing. One of the things that we do when we're doing our portfolio reviews is we kind of hand the mic over and we go, this is your meeting. This is your time. You spend it how you want to spend it. And there's obviously some things that we're looking for when we do that, but it's amazing how often people just let themselves spend their entire time sharing the story of half a project and not actually being really deliberate about what messages they want to get across. Like this is your opportunity to really say, here's what I want you to know about me, and to make sure that you're using that time to get through everything that you want to get through. So like, just from a logistical point of view, be really thoughtful about like how don't expect the interviewer to always take control of the timing. Sometimes we'll kind of hand it over to you and go, this is your time, you use it how you want to see fit. Like, be ready for that, and make sure you use it really well.
Maren?
Yes, I'm going to echo something Courtney said as well. She's a fount of wisdom. And it's around showing the impact of the work. So actually, what did you measure? What was the result? And a lot of times you might not have actually thought about this in the course of the project. That's pretty common. And so the follow-up question that I would always ask is, okay, well, if you could wave a magic wand, or if you could go back in time, what would you have measured? How would you know that you've actually solved this problem and had success? And I feel like, candidates are often unprepared for that. So my advice would be to be prepared for that question, because I think, that's kind of what people want to know, is not just what did you do and how did you do it, but how do you know that you were successful?
Yeah, I can go last. Related to what Leisa said, I definitely see people go way too deep into the weeds on a project, and they tell me a bunch of details that they don't help me get to the so what of it, or they don't help me understand how they thought about it or how they made decisions. And so if you're giving detail, make sure it's connected to, it's like really making a point, and it's showing something about how you accomplished your process, or how you accomplished and how you accomplished impact. Also, when people are getting really deep in the weeds, they're not reading my cues as an interviewer a lot of the time, where I'm trying to kind of ask them to keep moving forward, and I'm trying to help them. But if they're not reading my cues, that's also a pretty good indicator that like communication skills aren't super strong. So the more, I think it really goes back to storytelling, which we've talked a lot about today. So really think about your story and what details are important to kind of move that story forward and bring your interviewer along.
Great. So our first question from the audience is, if I haven't had exposure to mature design process or worked in an environment where I've collaborated with product and engineering, how can I present myself as a compelling candidate? Zack, Courtney?
It's a good question. Even if you haven't been exposed to it necessarily in the workplace, I think there's so many resources online. This is not something that it's hidden away. There's tons and tons of information about process and output, and you can learn about these things really easily. I think it's okay to be open and say, hey, I haven't had the opportunity to do these things. That's all right. But then if you show that you've actually done the research, you've spent the time learning, and you could talk, at least from a knowledge standpoint, of, hey, I understand how these things work, that's going to get you a lot farther. So I wouldn't worry about, you have to start somewhere. Don't worry about if you haven't had the experiences. It's really, at this point, just showing, hey, I have the ability to learn. I'm really excited and enthusiastic about this area. And that's going to take you, really far.
Yeah, I'd add to that, in addition to that, I think if you are picking up freelance projects or doing kind of like side projects to try to bolster your portfolio, do it with someone else. Because then you can talk about collaboration, and inevitably bringing more people into a process makes it more complicated and difficult. And also you achieve more together, right? So if you can tell a story about how you collaborated with someone, maybe that had a similar kind of type of design role as you, or maybe they were more of like a product type of role, or they're coding what you're building. Negotiating decisions with another person will help just push you into a more mature design process, just because you're working with someone else.
Great. This next question is for you, Maren. What do you look for in portfolios for content designers?
That is an excellent question. So, I mean, it's much the same as for design. Obviously, we have a very stringent eye for grammar and typos, which is the case across the board, but particularly so for content design. We'll notice these things more. But really, it's kind of the same thing with a content twist. So I think the difference for content design is, you know, you're still going to be running through a process. You're still going to have a problem. You're still going to have, you know, a team that you worked with. You're still going to have outcomes you wanted to achieve. It's just that the craft that you use is content. And I think, you know, keeping in mind, especially that content doesn't necessarily need to mean written content. It's about how did you help your audience through the problem that you were trying to solve. And so I think for me personally, that's kind of what I look for is thinking about content a bit more broadly than simply writing, but about the user's information experience. And I would say if there's one thing that I kind of see people not really doing, it's looking at content through that lens. And but other than that, it's, I mean, honestly, it's really a pretty similar process across all of these things. It's just about the actual project that you're presenting that might be a little bit different.
Great. Okay. I feel like Zach, we talked about this a little bit recently. What if I worked on a project that hasn't shipped? Should I still include this in my portfolio?
It depends on the work. You know, ultimately, look, I'd love to see the impact. That's kind of the end of the story, right? Is like how this affected things. But I think it depends on the project. That, look, if it's a gnarly problem you had to work through, if you came up with if you're happy with the solution and it's in the process, like let's just say it's being built, I think it's completely legitimate to show that and talk about it. I don't know if I'd necessarily lead it. I'd probably save it as like one of my other projects and, you know, down the stack, not the first one I'd lead off with. But I think it's, if you believe it shows your capabilities, you believe it's really representing your best work, and you feel like the ultimate solution that you put out there, at least to be built, is great, then yeah, show it. I would also say, thinking back on this, can you at least pull research into this? What kind of validation, right? What kind of metrics did you know, that's again, going back to the process, but what confidence do you have based on what research you've done that this is going to be successful? Tell that story. That's totally legit. So there you go. That's my best answer.
Thanks, Zach. And kind of thinking about projects that haven't shipped, but on the other end, would it be worthwhile to showcase a project that's a failure, but you had a huge learning experience and growth as a designer? How could you best position that? And Leisa, you've talked a lot about what you learned. I'd love to hear from both a research and a design perspective. Zach?
Oh, all right. So we're going to start with design. All right, great. Yeah, failure. I don't know if I would necessarily lead with it. It might be one of those things where it's kind of one of those, I don't even know if I would necessarily show it. I could talk to it. Here are the things I've learned and some of the challenge I've had. I remember I did have a portfolio review I had a number of years ago where I showed something, and at the end of it, I said, look, this is what the client wanted me to do, but here's actually what I would have done had I had the opportunity. And I talked about, here's the things that, you know, I would have done differently. And actually that's what got me the job, because they said, oh, okay, well, you really did think outside the box. We understand why the client went in a different direction. I think when you can talk about it and just show that you've progressed in your thought process and your learning, and you can really show that you have some flexibility in how you approach the work, I think it's okay. But I don't think I would lead with it as a portfolio piece that like, hey, this failed, right? That's not the right story you want to tell.
I think from a research point of view, we have to really distinguish between researching an idea or a product that failed versus a research project that failed. So the first one, sharing an example of a research project that you did where, you know, the ultimate outcome was that you decided not to proceed with the project, for example. That's 100% a valid and useful thing to present. If it's a project that you were involved with that was a complete failure from a research point of view, I would be thinking really carefully about whether or not it makes sense to include that in your story. Even if you have learned from it, I would probably focus on including the project that you did once you'd had that learning, and perhaps making reference to the fact that you had this learning experience that had educated you. But I don't know whether I would make a showcase out of a piece of research that I kind of regretted in a way. That said, you know, the fact that you have reflected on it and taken learnings and improved, I think, you know, Courtney's point earlier about the fact that every time we do a project, we would do it differently, is true, right? And so knowing that no project is ever perfect, and knowing that we should have reflected and thought about what we do differently, is super important.
Thank you. All right, another question is, if I don't have a lot of data, how do I point to outcomes or define success for a project? I don't always have clear-cut data for a piece of work. Marin, you've talked a lot about.
Yeah, I feel passionate about this one. So I think it's fine to say, here's what I wish I would have tracked in retrospect. And that's what I was trying to get to earlier. I think, you know, it is inevitable that you don't always have access to the data that you want, even at a company like Atlassian, or perhaps the timelines or the team that you're working on doesn't have access to tap into that. What we're not looking for is like literally the data. That's not the goal of the question. The question is to understand, did you think through, here's my problem, here's my approach, and here's how I'll measure the success of my approach? I don't care what the data is. I care that you thought through that process and have a good reason for, you know, tracking that metric for success. You know, this is not metrics for metrics' sake, is what I'm trying to say. It's metrics to understand the impact of your work and, you know, potentially evaluate if you need to iterate in the future, and really thinking through, how can I use data to improve that process.
I layer on one other thing, which is actually, this is something I see all the time with designers on the job, not just in portfolios, but when you're thinking about what success looks like, think about both, like, if it's successful, this is what I'll do, and if it fails, this is what I'll do. And a lot of times designers completely forget to think about what path they're going to take if it fails, because I think we're always optimistic and trying to think about like success and what comes next. So showing that process, I think shows a mature process as a designer. And also when we talk about data is qualitative and quantitative. So I think a lot of times we think about quantitative and can I track it, but qualitative data can give you different and richer insights than quantitative can. And so if you can't track metrics in code, you can always do research to understand impact.
Can I add to that as well and just say, it's not only, I'm certainly not only looking for product or customer impacts, I'm also looking for organizational impacts. I'm looking for impacts that you had within your organization. So, you know, a problem could be that there were just a whole bunch of people who were at a complete impasse and they didn't know where to go, or they didn't have a clear strategy, or they you know, all kinds of problems inside the organization that your work could help to unblock. So don't underestimate the internal organizational impacts as well. You probably won't have metrics for those, but you should have some really good stories.
Great. Thank you so much. And just one last question, and this is for everyone. And we'll start with Leisa and go back. What is one piece of advice that you want to offer any designer who is about to embark on either looking for their next step or their first step, designer or researcher?
One piece of advice, that's really hard. I'm glad you picked me to go first, Dominique. I think that the thing to remember in all of this is that most of the time, people really want you to do well. As we're going through this process, what we really want is someone who can come in and who engages with us and who has great stories to tell and who really obviously cares about our craft as much as we do. That's what we're looking for. So I think what part of what you can do and bringing a design mindset is really important to this, is think, how can you help us? How can you help us help you? How can you bring those stories? Like, don't approach this as though it's an examination. Approach it very much, you know, thinking that like we're looking for an opportunity to kind of create that connection between the stories and the experiences that you have and what we're looking for, and bring that sort of creative mindset to this. Don't bring this sort of examination mindset. I think that's, if you can change the context of this and bring sort of a designerly approach to how you take on this kind of portfolio and interview experience, there's a lot to be gained from that.
Great, thank you. Zack, what's your 15-20-second piece of advice?
Don't be afraid to let your personality really shine through in the portfolio review. That's going to tell us a whole lot. You can weave the entire story into your work and your own perspectives. I want to see that, because I want to understand who you are as a person just as much as who you are as your work.
Great. Maren?
I would say it's a personal one, but the hardest thing is just getting started, getting something down, and then you can start sharing that and, you know, collaborating and getting feedback on it. But don't be afraid, you know, don't spiral by reading 1,000 Medium articles. Just start with a framework, start with a template, start writing it down, and then go from there. Don't let it become too overwhelming.
And Courtney?
The advice I got when I was in my MBA program that I didn't listen to, which is that your career is very long. So if you're in a job that you don't love right now, or you're looking for a job and the ones in front of you are not the ideal ones, you're going to have a lot of jobs in your career. So start somewhere, learn, collect that experience, take it to the next step. You don't know what turns you're going to take. Like, all of us have taken some wonky turns to get to design. So just like, be where you are, like, be confident in that, learn what you can where you're at, and you'll get to the next thing.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you all to all the attendees and designers who are embarking on this journey, either freshly out of school or continuing on. And yeah, have a great evening, morning if you're in Australia. And thank you. The recording will be out in the next few days. All right.